My name is Tristan Roberts, and I'm so glad you're here. You've made it to Module 8 of the DeSci course, so surely you're committed. As a little treat, we will mind meld together so that we may glimpse the future of decentralized science. Before we go wide, let's go deep. How do we know what is true? When you come across a new idea, how do you evaluate it? Pause this video until you've come up with at least one answer. If you said first principles or first-hand experience, those are great, but they are practically impossible to scale. Other ways of knowing are almost always subject to social forces. There is no such thing as science removed from the economic and political forces that fund research, the interpretation of research, and the dissemination of those interpretations. In other words, the incentives around science shape the outcome. Rather than pretending that these forces are not at play, what if we could harness them? How can we make science into a game where everybody's playing on the same field? Another historical frame for decentralized science is the third scientific revolution. This quote from President Eisenhower describes the failings of the second scientific revolution, which happened during the 20th century. The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded. 64 years later, it looks like Eisenhower was right. Academics reportedly spend 80% of their time applying for grants rather than actually performing science. There is some serious brain drain going on where the best people are leaving the institutions so that they are not forced to deal with the systemic bullshit. In fact, that might be a contributing factor as to why you're watching this video now. I personally was radicalized by dating a National Science Foundation grants manager, but that's a topic for another talk. Before we go further, allow me to provide an overview of the contents of this talk. We'll start with some of the bigger picture aspirations for the decentralized science movement before focusing on the biotech R&D pipeline, showing how DeSci can bridge the biotech valley of death. We'll cover both the building blocks of DeSci and the systems we can build out of them. I'll tie together these ideas with some user stories, and then we'll zoom out to look at the bigger picture about what all of this means for society at large. We'll then cover the four main problems: trust, coordination, incentives, and safety, while exploring technical solutions for them. If you'd like to skip ahead, you can use these numbers on the right and then look at the slide number in the bottom right. Let's begin with an overview of some of the greatest problems that decentralized science might help solve. The big overall problem is truth-making. Right now, we have truth by institution or truth by podcaster. Hopefully, we can make it faster and cheaper to prove something, and for these proofs to be less brittle and more open to changes as new data comes in. We want to see the biotech valley of death bridged, which means that it's cheaper and easier to start building up evidence that a therapy works and to be able to then raise funds to be able to bring it to market. We want to see research in underserved areas become empowered. Right now, unless a research area is academically sexy or regulatorily plausible, it is impractical to conduct meaningful research. That is to say, in the academic world, you won't be able to get funding or even publish in a respectable journal if you stray far from the mainstream. In some cases, this might even be because a new finding or connection could upturn years of research, causing countless old windbags to lose their prestige. Examples include quantum biology and holistic medicine. For biomedical R&D, if there's no pathway to market approval or having a patent, it's pretty much impossible to fund a clinical study. And this is the case for nootropics, longevity, peptides, and so on. We also have a bit of an issue with the replication crisis. The extent of this varies from field to field, but roughly it seems like half of all papers if another lab tries to do the exact same experiment, they don't get the same results. There's a lot of factors for this problem, but it seems like the incentivization of citation count is contributing to this, because scientists are rewarded for just producing a lot of content, and that drives up their ability to get tenure, but at the risk of causing there to be a bunch of slop that isn't replicatable. We want to see transparent, verifiable supply chains for therapeutics, whether they're FDA approved or not. We want to be able to buy things on the internet and have a good amount of confidence that it is what we think it is. And broadly, we want to democratize access to science. We don't want people to have to go through a PhD in a system that they know is broken in order to be able to be a real scientist. So let's start with some of the basic building blocks for crypto that we can use to build more complicated things over time. Prediction markets as a way of coordinating research. Bio DAOs for patient-driven research funding and organizing. IPTs and IP-NFTs for making claims and aligning incentives. Decentralized identity for researcher participant reputation. Verifiable credentials for supply chain certification. Token curated registries for approving vendors or researchers or really anything where you need trust. And then lastly, composable research objects, which are kind of a way of indexing articles, data, methods, and code on the blockchain. We'll go into these ideas in more depth one by one, starting with prediction markets. Here's a couple of examples of prediction markets. The basic idea is that you can bet yes or no, and then at the end of the period of time, the winners receive some funds and the losers lose their funds. There's multiple ways in which this can be determined. Perhaps the person who posted it is the judge. Perhaps an API call to a crypto market or to some weather data is the deciding factor. Or sometimes it's a third-party judge who doesn't have any involvement is able to close the market. Here are some examples of prediction markets surrounding a anti-cavity treatment. The best phrasing for these questions is still evolving, but you can see how this information would be very helpful to someone considering whether to invest into a biotech project. Here's an overview of the active prediction markets right now. There's kind of a split between centralized and decentralized. Polymarket is built on Ethereum. Manifold is currently using imaginary money, but they're looking at pivoting into real blockchain money. And then Kalshi started as a traditional entity, but is also moving into blockchain. It seems like people who are really good at these are called super predictors, and it's possible to take your account, your reputation on these systems and then get a job in finance because you're able to predict things better than the average person. There's a notable bug or feature of prediction markets, which we can probably sum up as hyperstition, which is a cultural belief that makes itself real. As a specific prediction gains liquidity, there is increasingly a motivation for somebody to do something about it. So we'll point to this example of Brian Armstrong recently at the end of a call for Coinbase, just named a bunch of words because there was a prediction market that was like, is he going to say this? Is he going to say that? Is he going to say this? And in order to just kind of mess with them, he just said all of them. And so this is really not like the best use of prediction markets. It's because it's so manipulatable. But there's a way of thinking about this where a company, a CEO, is looking at what the public thinks might happen, and it can influence their decision-making process, creating a feedback loop that causes this idea to turn into reality. The worst case, though, are assassination markets. If people are betting about whether or not somebody is alive, they could be incentivized to assassinate the person. But what if we could use this feature slash bug of hyperstition to turn science ideas into market realities? And that's really the role of the Bio DAOs. These are the most successful example of decentralized science so far. The first ones were able to raise hundreds of ETH, focusing on specific research areas that have been usually underserved. Beta DAO, for instance, and Hair DAO for hair loss. What makes Bio DAOs unique is that there's a tendency for the token holders to be the patients. So they're more motivated to actually see this happen, regardless of whether this is going to be highly profitable. I'm assuming that you've already come across IPTs and IP-NFTs, but briefly, it's the idea that these tokens are tied to a patent or a provisional patent or just the beginnings of a patent, and that the people who have control over the token are then voting about how that IP ends up being used. A lot of these DAOs end up creating sub-DAOs, which perhaps have their own governance structure, which are responsible for certain things like deal flow. Sometimes they have their own tokens, sometimes they don't. For Vita DAO, they've made these IP tokens, which are kind of like sub-projects, so that the parent entity owns a good chunk of this sub-entity, and that allows them to de-risk it because they're opening it up to other investors and expand their portfolio so that they're involved in a lot of projects. Decentralized identity is one of the foundations that we need in order for most of these things to work. There's already been a standard developed by the W3C group. They are a group of passionate technology nerds that have been thinking about this problem for decades, but hardly anybody is using this standard yet. Google wants us to be stuck to email as a form of ID, and the platforms that we're addicted to don't want us to leave, creating some difficulty for mass adoption. So how does decentralized identity work? Instead of a username, it kind of looks like this. Instead, this is a DID. It's on the Ethereum network, and this is the actual name on the Ethereum network. Each of these has a way of how to verify this, so that way, when I go to log in to some other platform, it's able to go look at the Ethereum network and then prove that I am that person that I say that I am. So this is really important because it allows us to go from platform to platform and from blockchain to blockchain without losing all of our account information. A similar standard that's being developed by W3C is the verifiable credential. These are designed to represent information found in physical credentials, such as passports or licenses, as well as digital-only attributes like ownership of a bank account. I'm using the passport icon for this because rather than the government checking your credentials, anybody can check someone else's credential. Verifiable credentials are cryptographically signed, making them tamper-resistant and instantaneously verifiable. They use systems similar to blockchains to verify the claims when they're presented, but the nodes that the network is using, they don't see the information. They just are processing it, but they don't actually see the details of who's talking to who. They're just returning, yes, this looks legit, or no, this does not legit. And what's exciting is that it's possible to revoke these certifications after they've been issued, which is like a problem with using NFTs as like a badge. It's like, well, what happens if you think that person should no longer have that badge? How do you revoke it? Verifiable credentials have all of these features built in. And again, they haven't really been utilized yet, but I think that in the next years we'll see them have more traction. Token curated registries were a concept that gained a lot of popularity around 2018, 2019, and then kind of faded into obscurity. But I think the basic idea is really valuable, and we'll see some sort of evolution of these over time. They could be used for all sorts of things: journalists, arbitrators, scientists. Typically, a user will stake some of the token in order to be considered for approval. If their proposal is denied or if someone challenges them later, they could lose their deposit and their certification. This creates a transparent mechanism for gating that is incentivized to provide a good signal. If the group is no longer serving its goal, the token should lose its value. I think something like this will be used for reputation more broadly, where each group is kind of vetting its own candidates. Smart contract royalty trees. Right now, one of the biggest problems for intellectual property and biotech development is licensing. Like, you have to, if you're trying to build something that has pieces from multiple companies, trying to get all of them to be like working together is really, really difficult. And a lot of projects fail just because of that coordination issue. But what if instead we just say, hey, this is my new gene therapy vector. If anybody uses it, just give me 10% of it. And if someone builds on top of my vector, that's fine. Just give me 5% of anything you make. And then we no longer have to go get permission from the patent holder. We can just honor the obligations that they requested and then go forth and build. And this is still potentially protected by IP, where it's like if someone takes the idea and doesn't give them the 10%, then they can be sued. But at the same time, it creates kind of a two-tier system where there's like the official licensed version, and then people can still do knockoff pirated versions. And I think this is important because no one should go to jail for creating a treatment, even if it's patented. But at the same time, there needs to be pressure to get the official version of the product. And in biomedicine, people will pay extra for the product to be the official non-generic version. So I think this model is a way to scale without having to rely upon the old systems so much. Composable research objects are a clunky name for an important concept. Maybe they'll get named something differently over time, but the basic idea is that we have an address on a blockchain that is now kind of like the stub for an article. It might just have the name of the article and then a links to IPFS that has the actual content, the text of the article, the code from the experiment that was run to analyze the data, and then the data itself. And this is great because you can potentially have different papers that are referencing the same data. You can have people collect their own data and then run your same analysis scripts to see if they get the same similar outcomes. And all of this is geared towards making science more reproducible because all of the pieces that you need are right there instead of buried in multiple issues of journals. DeSci Labs has been building this, but I think the problem is, of course, getting traction. How do you get the scientists to switch from their old system to the new system? We'll go through some more crypto primitives that are really important, even if perhaps not the most exciting topic. And these are 3 different ways of thinking about data for decentralized science. And each has its own use case, and we'll dive into like when is it appropriate to use these things and how do they work a little bit. The first one is tamper-evident data logs. This is a record-keeping system that makes it obvious if anyone tries to change historical data after it's been recorded. It answers the question of how do we know that the data is the same as what it was when it was originally submitted? And this is really important because people fake stuff. They Photoshop their documents, they keep using the same like ELISA output and just modify it a little bit. And so this has caused a lot of p-hacking and selective reporting. And if we can hopefully make it so that everything has to be out in public to some degree at the start, and if you change it, we know that you changed it, it reduces the demand for cheating pretty much. So how do we do this? When you have a file, whether it be like a data set or the protocol for your study, you can fingerprint it. It's called a hashing. And that creates like a small amount of text that is going to be incredibly different when you have a slight change in the data. Just one change in the data is going to cause the hash to be different. And so what you can do is like when you first get the data, you put that hash onto a blockchain, or you can just publish it on Twitter. And then you have a timestamp of like, I had this at this point in time. And then later on, if people accuse you of changing it, you can say, here's the file, you'll get the same hash. You can look at this hash that's been timestamped a year ago. It hasn't changed. And that provides a lot of certainty for both the people producing and the people who are questioning, what happened. Zero knowledge proofs are the next form. This is a mathematical method to prove that you know something or that something is true without revealing the actual information. It solves the problem of how can I prove my credentials without exposing sensitive details? The use case of this that's most common is that you're trying to prove that you're over 21 to enter a bar, but you don't want them to know your birthday. You don't want them to know your address or your name. All they need to know is, are you over 21 or not? So these systems are great for preserving privacy while still allowing people to know that you're legitimate. And so we could see things like credentials for biotechnologists that work on the fringes to be able to prove that they are legit without having to reveal who they are necessarily. And then lastly, homomorphic encryption is useful for when we're trying to do analyses of data sets that are sensitive. And so like genomic information is the most common example, where we don't want that information going around the internet, because anytime it moves, we could potentially get hacked, and then all of this important genomic information that's tied to our names is leaked, and it's just a huge security risk. But what if you're trying to do genomic analysis and you don't have a huge database of genomic information? Well, it should be possible to use homomorphic encryption so that you can analyze it without necessarily seeing the actual details to begin with. It's kind of like, like a locked box with gloves built in it. And you can manipulate the items in the box, but you can't see what's in the box. And you know the manipulations are correct, but you never see the contents. And so this could be useful for clinical trial information, drug discovery, health data marketplaces. It's definitely more computer intensive to do it this way, but if you're just doing something like statistical analysis, then it's usually fine and suitable. So now that we have some of the building blocks laid out, we can start to build more complex systems. We could call these models or mechanisms. The name doesn't really matter too much, but first one is AI copilots that scrape studies, testimonials, scientific data. They can review proposals, they can flag conflicts of interest, and crucially, they could start making bets on prediction markets and on IP tokens based upon their findings. Adversarial research groups are kind of a related concept, where people who are perhaps able to do experiments cheaply combine with investors, and they look for tokens or products that are overhyped and then conduct independent research and then publish the research after they've taken a position on the market. We'll go into a more concrete example shortly. So IPTs and IP-NFTs can be combined with the cascading royalty trees that we mentioned previously. So that way we can start building these entire complex ecosystems of biomedical IP that are no longer having to get permission to use them. You just simply plug your revenue into the smart contract address. Whenever you make money, it sends it to the other creators, and now everybody's happy, and we didn't have to get the lawyers involved. Retroactive public goods funding for successful treatments or other moonshot ideas. The basic idea is like you're putting a bounty on a huge project, and whenever someone is able to prove that they completed the bounty, they get the money afterwards, which is not great because you don't have the money to actually do the research. But if you can like get loans or whatever, or grants to do the beginning part, you can then get rewarded for accomplishing this big problem. And then lastly, the certified supply chains, where producers and vendors take the reputation and then receive credentials that they can then use to prove that they are legitimate vendors to end consumers. Here is a schematic of a certified supply chain in action. Many academics and biohackers want people to use their new treatments, but they don't want the legal liability. Still, most of them will put their reputation behind the treatment. So what if those researchers are able to certify factories that they trust to produce the treatment? And what if those factory producers, what if they are then able to certify a distributor? And as an end consumer, when you're talking to a gray market pharmacy, you're able to prove that this supply chain goes all the way back to the scientists that you trust. So there's multiple ways that this could work out, but maybe the researcher is only making money from certifying the producers, or maybe it's possible that whenever there's a sale, the money goes to all three of them. But having this layer in between prevents the researcher from having liability from selling something to end consumers. And I think this is kind of a change of the paradigm because that means that the inventor is no longer there to file a patent and then collect on that for the rest of their lives. It's more about they are now the steward for the supply chain. And if someone's having a problem with the producers or the distributors, they should go to them. And then the researcher should potentially revoke the certification if they think that there's like a distributor that's selling bad product. And we could also imagine third-party labs down here that are certifying these groups for purity, so that way there's like a third party that's also involved. All of this taken together, especially with the certification chain and royalty trees, it builds a new pathway through the biomedical valley of death. One without the FDA, without the patent system. To recap, at the beginning of this pipeline, social media and basic research feeds into prediction markets. These prediction markets, or IPTs, help capital form around the hypothesis. A study is executed to close the market or to generate the initial data. Public experts then certify producers of the treatment. Producers certify distributors. Third-party labs conduct purity tests. And consumers are able to verify the certification chain with the option of contributing their own data in sort of a rolling decentralized study. And this allows people to match their risk preference to reality. I mean, when I talk to people about gene therapy, I like to ask, how many people have to have done this before you feel comfortable doing it yourself? 5 people? 50? 500? Depending on the situation and the person, those numbers are different. And rather than just having it's FDA approved or not, if we have this kind of rolling process, it opens up a lot of freedom. So let's start with an example of a patient. They're researching about their condition, and she finds that this article suggests that treatment X resulted in a 70% chance of improvement. She drills down in the article, and it's found out that it's a composable research object, which includes a list of treatment vendors that the scientist believes is capable of producing treatment X. This is crucial for also reproducibility as well, right? Where if you're like, hey, I think these are the same people that are generated the product, so it should be reproducible for you if you get it from those same people. So she examines the suppliers and finds that one of them has received a certification by a third-party lab for purity testing on treatment X. This makes her feel more comfortable about buying it, and then she uses cryptocurrency to purchase it. She receives the shipment in the mail and posts her own outcome, and this is able to be indexed into the composable research object, linking her experience to both the producer and the distributor. So that if we see results that are different between distributors, then maybe one of them is potentially sending bad product. But if all of the data is looking good, then now we have more and more certainty that this treatment is working. So from a researcher's perspective, let's say that the researcher had a fantastic idea and they've been spending months in back and forth with a grants agency, and eventually the grants agency is just like, no, at this time, we just don't think we can move forward. And so then the researcher is like, well, screw this. I'm going to go to a DAO. The DAO members debate about it. They realize that they don't really know. They don't have strong feelings yet. So they make a prediction market. Will this treatment work for this condition? And then maybe the prediction market is suggested that it will work. The DAO then votes to grant the resources to complete the study. The researcher publishes the data on chain and then creates a royalty tree with the DAO. Later, researchers are able to fork the idea, and whenever they make money, they send a fraction of that money back to the original researcher and the DAO that funded the study. Adversarial research groups, one of my favorite concepts. And what's important with these is that it can be profitable whether your results are for or against a hypothesis. Right now in science, whenever you're doing a study, you're almost always have an outcome in mind that you want to see happen. And that leads to people putting their thumb on the scale because they want to be able to keep getting funding, and if your study isn't significant, then you might not get funding in the future, and it's just a really toxic environment. So let's say that in this group, some members notice that a new therapy is gaining a lot of funding, but it feels overhyped. After hearing from a confidant that the treatment was ineffective in his personal experience, the group decides to conduct a small-scale study to try to replicate the original findings. The results of their study indicate that the treatment is not very effective, and so the group places a short position on the corresponding IPT. Immediately afterwards, they announce their study's findings. As the group's reputation is spotless, the market follows after them. This sends the price of the IPT down, and this allows the research group to recover the costs from running the independent study. So whether they prove or disprove it, if they have a strong reputation, they should be able to move the market. And this creates a niche for these groups to do replication studies and still get funding for it. Next up, we have an online vendor. This online peptide vendor sees demand for a new therapy. They do some investigation and they find out that some of the producers are listed as certified to one of the composable research objects. The vendor then stakes some crypto and is able to get a certification to be a supplier. They purchase a large batch of the treatment and begin offering it online. When a customer messages them and asks for proof that they're legit, they're able to send them a code that the end consumer is able to take to a verifiable claims registry and then prove that it's actually legitimate. This is great because they're able to prove not necessarily just that they have that link to the research team, but they're also able to prove that, hey, I have a ton of positive reviews. I'm not going to tell you what they're for, but I do have a lot of positive reviews. And this is a great way of empowering vendors to develop their reputation. And then lastly, I'll talk about my experience with Dog Years DAO. The basic idea is while working with a biotech company, I came across a new use case for a treatment. So now I'm going to tokenize the study's IP. I'm going to raise funds with crypto for this IPT. I'm planning on requiring my study participants to stake a small amount of crypto to participate. And then when they're done with the study, they get IPTs or they lose their stake, depending on if they complete it or not. Eventually, I'm hoping to form a federated longevity data pool that allows participants to enter and exit at will. And this is ties into this question of why is DeSci and longevity a good match? Bio DAO was probably the first successful bio DAO in terms of raising over $1 million. Longevity affects all of us, but it's not evaluated by the FDA, so it's really hard to raise investment funds. Long-term studies are an immense coordination problem, and right now, multi-interventions are probably going to be how we actually move the needle on longevity. But if all of our clinical trials are only looking at one thing, then there's going to be this disconnect between the reality. And hopefully, as homomorphic encryption and all of this develops, we'll be able to have huge pools of longevity data where not one group has control over it. It's actually siloed in many different places. People can put their data in, they can take their data out, and it's able to keep moving forward without having some of these structural issues. So we've seen how DeSci can transform biomedicine, but the infrastructure we're building has implications far beyond drug development. Really, DeSci is about redesigning how humans make and validate knowledge. So let's zoom out and look at some of the bigger societal impacts that might happen. So we've already mentioned this new biomedical vertical. That is crucial, I think, for getting DeSci started because it's such a area of improvement that we can start here and then expand outwards to other topics beyond just biomedical R&D. So hopefully, if DeSci is successful, we'll see the FDA pushed from being an efficacy gatekeeper to instead being focused on safety and purity. Hopefully, we'll start to see more truth through transparency. So, markets and cryptographic verification replacing opaque institutions who are doing that work now. We want to see risk personalization so that individuals are able to choose their comfort level of like how many people have to have done this first, rather than just having the binary approved or unapproved. We would like to see traditional biotech integrate DeSci for early stage research or become obsolete because they're no longer generating new leads because it takes too much money, and so they end up losing out on the future of biomedicine. And we're hoping that things are just easier to find on the internet. The move from public index forums to private Discord Slack chats is like a mini dark age. So hopefully we can have the opposite of that in the coming years as more of this metadata becomes on-chain. So I think we'll really see in people's brains that this changes everything moment when we see like a major scientific discovery that comes from being identified by a hypothesis or researcher that's kind of like out there. They're not really in the mainstream. The research is funded by a DAO. The data is time-stamped and certified by lab instruments. The study is replicated by a prediction market, and the findings are published in a decentralized journal. All of this happening while the traditional system is still debating whether or not to fund the research. Put it in a different way, I think when we're able to consistently prove that DeSci works in a matter of weeks and like tens of thousands of dollars, and is able to accomplish the same thing that it takes years and billions of dollars in the traditional system. Once that clicks, I think, scientists will start moving over from the old system to the new system. And until then, we can't just tell scientists, oh, your journal is corrupt, you should come to our journal, because there's no network effect. The scientists will follow where the money is, and so we have to get the money flowing, and then hopefully DeSci will spread to all of academia and not just biomedicine. And they don't teach you this in STEM, but science is deeply tied to politics, and I think truth is kind of upstream of politics, where if our truth-making institutions are no longer like spilling over into society, then politics becomes clumsy at best, right? And I think we saw this with COVID, right? Where like there was an echo chamber on both sides and neither one was really able to critically evaluate information. And it's because the people at the top of each side had such strong incentives that there was no room for middle ground. So hopefully we're going to see more and more time-stamped certification of writing, images, and data, especially in this era of deepfakes and LLMs. We will probably have images that are signed by the camera itself, and that way if there's any modification later, it's easy to show that it was photoshopped or whatever, and that's going to be crucial because everything is like potentially, AI generated at this point. So hopefully we're going to see bad actors pushed to the margins of society, and I don't just mean like bad scientists or scammers or whatever, but I mean like bad politicians who lie a lot, or bad business people who scam consistently and then just keep going from one community to another, scamming people. If we can have more reliance upon reputation, then if you see someone who just comes to your community and they don't have any reputation, it's like, well, why are you? I mean, what's going on here, right? We're hoping to see that attention flows more easily into capital formation and then to manifest it into reality, to use a new age term. But it's true. Like we have to go from idea to product to testing, distribution. And if we can create the rails, like a railroad for this, then we can see all sorts of new things come into reality. And then lastly, I think that certifications and reputation might become more and more important, eventually making liquid currency like cash like less important, right? Like right now, if you have a bunch of cash, that's a signal that you're like good in our society. But if instead it becomes like, well, how many people have said you're a good scientist? How many people have said that your treatment has impacted their life? All of these things can eventually become really kind of more important than just like, do you have a bunch of money or a bunch of stuff? And that's part of the whole transition to a post-scarcity economy where we no longer have like a shortage of physical goods, but we still have a shortage of something, and that's reputation and social currency. So we've seen where we're going, but we still have some really big problems before we get there. And the rest of this talk is going to cover these 4 problems, and we'll look at the technology solutions that can help solve these problems. The first one is like trust. How do we know what's true without institutions? Coordination, how do we work together at a global scale? Incentives, how do we get everybody working together with the same motivation? And then safety, how do we protect people without gatekeepers? So the first problem is, how do we know what's true? What we opened with, right? Traditionally, science has relied upon institutional prestige for trust. Did it come from Harvard or come from a garage? Was it in Nature or on a blog? Who funded the research? You could have the same exact paper published on a blog versus Nature, and it's going to mean very different things to scientists. And as these institutions are crumbling under their own weight, it becomes more important for DeSci to come up with a replacement for this. And I think the solution is making a social graph of science that's auditable. So this means that every citation, every collaboration, every data contribution, every peer review, and every usage of equipment can become traceable and analyzable. If you've seen cryptocurrency transaction logs before, you know that there's all this information about, oh, this went from this person, this address to that address, and all of that. But it's really dense, right? You can't really easily make sense of all of this. But when you start putting it in a graph, like over here, then it becomes more and more apparent the connections between things and the patterns between things. And we've just already seen in science some attempt for this for things like journals, authors, keywords, but it's not entirely easily discoverable. It's not entirely open and out there. You have to kind of like scan through journals and collect all the metadata. And so hopefully as DeSci matures, more and more of this metadata becomes on-chain, and then it's easier to start to find patterns that are interesting in it. And by the way, this kind of sophisticated graph analysis is what Palantir is doing to all of us under the assumption that we're all potentially terrorists or credit card scammers. It's very effective, but only if you have enough data. They have all the data from the US government, so that's why they are able to do their thing. So what are some of the problems that we can solve with network analysis? Citation cartels, where people are just kind of like, hey, I'll cite your article if you cite my article, and then it creates this kind of feedback loop of, oh, these people must be really important. Their articles are getting cited so much. When it's like, no, they're just scamming the system, right? And that should be pretty easily identified when you have all of this on a graph. We can also see how quickly ideas spread within a subfield, and if something is not spreading, then we have a suspicion that there's something else going on that's worth investigating. We can also see diversity metrics, where if a single field is like dominated by like an institution or a small group of actors, then we can flag that and start calling them out for it. And we can also just see if fields are rejecting new ideas, and it doesn't really make sense why, and then we can look at the analysis and then say, oh, it's because this group of people is blocking new ideas. So the maturation of DeSci would bring about not just an automated way of detecting these problems, but also potentially betting against them in some level, whether it be like the reputation or the outcome of their experiments or what have you. So for all of this data integrity and provenance, we need to have tamper-proof data. We've already covered that briefly previously, but expanding a little bit more, we want to see instruments certifying the results that they're generating, and that way you really just can't fabricate it. We want to see methodology being logged. I think smart lab devices will start having more and more of this so that you can kind of see what was the protocol that was running on that OpenTrons machine or that smart rat cage. So that way, if someone's going to reproduce this, they can just copy and paste and they know that it's the exact same protocol. We need better chain of custody so that we can see where did these samples go, like where did they come from? All of that is really important. And then computerized reproducibility, so that if I run these statistics on this data, somebody else can run the exact same thing and they get the same outcome, or if that's not the case, then something's wrong and we can identify that early. And so what could go wrong with data fraud is mostly bad actors submitting manipulated data. But how do we catch them without centralized review? So if we have these instruments that are timestamping things, if we have adversarial research groups and AI co-pilots that are looking for fraud, maybe they see it's kind of at risk, and then we do more analysis and it shows, oh yeah, there's definitely something going on here that's suspicious. And then we could perhaps challenge a claim and then have a peer jury that investigates it. And then the person who committed the fraud loses some sort of reputation or some sort of stake. So that way it becomes unprofitable to commit fraud and profitable to actually do good science. Hopefully we will see a revolution in peer review that comes from this new system. So perhaps reviewers are staking the tokens on their assessments. They have skin in the game now. They can no longer just upvote their friends and downvote their enemies, which is a problem right now. We could also see post-publication review markets so that people can bet on this article and be like, oh, that's not going to replicate. We should, and not trust this. And then if enough people are like, oh, that's not going to replicate, there's demand to go do that replication, and hopefully then we have a better idea if this is actually a true finding. Automated pre-review, so that we see AI checking things like statistics and methodology before the humans get there, which should hopefully save time. But it's important still to have a combination of AI and humans so that there's accountability built into the system. And then I think we'll see just more specialization for qualified reviewers that are perhaps using token curated registries or some other way of doing reputation. The first example of this with some traction is Research Hub. You can post anything on there and get peer review within like a few days pretty much. So it's a great model that just makes this institution more accessible. And then we might see academic monopolies broken up. Decentralized journals are one possibility, but they face a rather difficult problem. Not technology, but network effect. A journal is only credible when people believe it's credible, making a difficult problem for bootstrapping. If we see decentralized identity take off, we hope to see that researchers are more easily able to go between institutions and fields. We want to see that people who are talented in the globe are able to get attention and get funding even if they didn't go to Harvard. And we should also be able to see this automated fraud detection in place so that we're able to find that before we've spent 10 years and billions of dollars going down the wrong pathway. And so as we see reputation develop beyond just H-index, we want to see who actually ran the experiments versus just who supervised. There's a problem in science right now where like the person who got the grant gets all the credit even though they didn't do much of the work. And I think that hopefully we can start better identifying who actually did the work and not just who has control over the system. We want to see that negative results are being incentivized, rewarded, so that maybe people get reputation points for publishing failed replications, because those are actually very informative. If something doesn't replicate, that's good, but it's not sexy because, oh, you didn't get your p-value. And so like there's like this negative incentive right now. We want to see people getting some sort of credits for sharing data, even if they didn't publish an article. If it's like, hey, I have this amazing data set, go use it. You should be able to like publish that in some way and still get some sort of credit. And then hopefully we start to see metrics for teaching and mentorship so that the best teachers and their students are able to be identified so that people who want to get trained can just go to the best teachers rather than having to go through the institutions that gatekeep them. This is the operational layer, all the pieces that we need to develop in order to be able to get better graph information. We need protocol repositories that are version controlled. We need dashboards where people can actually make sense of all this information, because otherwise it's just a waste. We need more metadata, so that way we can actually navigate this web of information. And we need some ethics review mechanisms, so that way when things are flagged, they actually go somewhere instead of it just being a drop in the bucket. So what are some ways that we could see this graph, working in areas outside of biomedical development? For climate science, we want to have the instruments themselves signing off on their data, so that way it's tamper-proof. For psychology, we could potentially have decentralized participant pools, and that way they have a better grasp of who's actually signing up for these. And psychology, a lot of it is just like, this is just on college students, and therefore is this actually a useful finding or just useful for college students? And also, if they register their hypothesis at the beginning, that reduces the likelihood for them to be able to do p-hacking and be like, well, we found this is significant, and now we're going to make that our narrative, even though that wasn't what you were looking for originally. Astronomy, we could see this being used to coordinate observation networks, and if a telescope was used, they automatically get paid, and they automatically get credit for any papers that come out afterwards. And for material sciences, we want to see verified property measurements, especially for these big claims about huge fundamental technology. If we could see that the instruments were saying that and not just the scientists, that gives more credibility to the idea, and they could potentially share this with IP protection using the IPT system. Okay, now we're on to section 2, the coordination problem. DeSci has to do a lot of heavy lifting while maintaining quality and safety. And traditional institutions solve this with hierarchy and control, but how do we coordinate without a central authority? Here's kind of a graphical representation of the challenge, right? We have like the DAO incentives, multilingual teams, and regulatory zones. And as these circles grow, all of the friction in the middle just grows as well. And so we need to have tools that help reduce the amount of friction going forward, if we're able to actually do science globally. So now we'll get into some of the tools, the foundational bits that we can use to build more complex models to solve some of these coordination problems. We're definitely going to need to see bioethics boards in some way or another, where committees are able to review things that are flagged. Maybe they're from the actual DAO or a group of DAOs, or maybe they're just dedicated to just solving the problem itself. There's already institutional review boards, but they're generally not open to outsiders, and they're generally not open to crypto, and so there's kind of a demand right now for something like this, and I think we'll see it in the next couple of years form. So dual governance is the desire to make money by token holders. It needs to be restrained by something. If it's just like trying to make the number go up, then that's going to lead to bad science. And so having a system where maybe like the DAO is voting on things, but some experts are able to veto things, that creates a hybrid system where you kind of get the best of both worlds. We're going to see sub-DAOs that are specialized for just specific things, like finding new deals. These are exciting because they can be kind of an experiment in governance themselves. Maybe the DAO uses democracy, but this uses something else, like liquid democracy or quadratic voting. We want to see proof of participation, where people who are contributing to the DAO are somehow empowered. Maybe their votes are stronger. Maybe they're able to help veto things because they've been working on the actual thing and they have a better idea if this is actually good. We should see reputation decay, so that if someone was really active in a DAO at the beginning, but then they just kind of ghosted, and then like 3 years later they can just show up and take control, that's really not ideal. So maybe it's like if you keep contributing every 6 months, then your power retains, but otherwise it starts to fade away. And then peer juries for disputes that aren't necessarily ethical. Maybe it's just a matter of fraud. Maybe it's a matter of resolving an adverse event. Having peer juries that are able to decide on things that aren't easily corruptible is really important. So with all of that in mind, let's look at an example of governance failure. The whale. A whale is just someone who has a bunch of crypto or money, and they're able to manipulate voting once they have a bunch of tokens. And perhaps the worst case is when they take over your DAO and then decide to vote on sending all of the money to their address. That's really bad. But there could also be something more mild, like they're funding research that is unethical or just poorly designed, or they're like funding the marketing team way too much because they just want the token value to go up, but they don't really care about doing science. So there's no perfect solution to preventing this from happening, but there's ways of minimizing the risk. Hybrid governance, like we mentioned previously, where maybe experts are able to veto proposals that they think are wrong. That could help prevent this from happening. AI flagging conflicts of interest, so that if you're just voting to give all your money to your friend, that's identified and it's called out, and therefore everybody else who's voting is not going to vote for that, hopefully. And we could also see like the vote weight is modified by participation, so that maybe your tokens are multiplied by your participation tokens, and then the people who are participating and have money in the DAO are able to direct the DAO more than people who just have a bunch of money in the DAO. So reputation weighted voting is an example of that. Quadratic voting is another mechanism where the square root of a person's tokens is used to vote against other people. So that way, if you have a huge amount, you're not necessarily going to be able to outvote everybody else because you have a square root of that. And then we could also see soulbound tokens that decay over time being used to mediate this, so that the founding team has a lot of influence at the beginning, but over time that decays, and that creates a way of preventing capture by a whale early on. So another concern for global coordination is like, where do we actually do the science, right? Like, it's great to like think about things and plan them out on the internet, but ultimately you need to have a lab space. You need to be able to do the research, to store the samples, and to have your equipment be calibrated and certified. And it's just nice to have a place to like meet your fellow DeSci researchers and train them and build community. So there's a couple examples we'll go through of this. Right now, I'm a member of Frontier Tower in San Francisco. I love it because people there just get it. They don't assume that just because there's crypto involved that it's a scam. They understand the complexities of opportunities of new governance. And truly, Frontier Tower itself is an experiment in decentralized governance. Each floor is a different theme and a different community. There's one for AI, for longevity, for biotech, for neurotech, for makerspace, for music, and so on. And they each have their own leadership. I use Frontier Tower as a hybrid hub to receive shipments which require a business address. That's one of the first obstacles you come across as a citizen scientist, is that people just won't ship you the materials unless you have a business address. But I also use it to do pipetting and lab work. And it's only $200 a month for access to a lab, which is remarkably like accessible, I think. Another special economic zone / hybrid hub is Prospera. They are a small piece of an island of Honduras that has legislation that's very favorable for biotech startups. And so it's cheaper and faster to run a phase 1 study there. They still use IRBs to actually do the approval, so that way there's still some oversight. After you do a phase 1 and prove safety, it's possible to commercialize your treatment and start selling it on the island. This is really useful for being able to generate demand and data, which you can then use to pivot to a larger jurisdiction after proving the concept here. All right, section 3, the incentive problem. Traditional science right now is incentivizing some good things, but sometimes they're over-indexed, I would say. So having more articles and more citations is more valuable than having a few really good articles. Publishing in Nature is like such a big deal compared to publishing in smaller journals, and it really has no direct reflection on the quality or the importance of the work. And this is creating echo chambers where you have to make it appealing to the editors of the journal, and it's just bad. And then people want positive results over null findings. If you keep getting null findings, you might no longer be able to get funding, which is really messed up because sometimes that's really important to show that you didn't get a result, right? And then also just staying in your lane is valued, where if you are pursuing a line of thought that goes against the experts in your field, they might come after you, right? And they might not do it directly, but there is pressure to conform or get out of the academia. So how can we rewire the incentive structures? How can we make good science profitable and bad science expensive is the way of thinking about this. So funding mechanisms, as we mentioned previously, retroactive funding is something that can be used not just for moonshots, but also for reproduction. So that way there's kind of a bounty there so that if you make a copy of this study, you're going to get paid even if it goes with or against the hypothesis and the findings of the original study. Similarly, prediction markets for paper claims. Will this finding replicate? Will this theory hold? If a bunch of people are saying no on the prediction market, now there's suddenly like money on both sides of the equation for people to go do reproduction and hopefully generate more data. Micro grants via DAOs so that we can just skip the university and grants agency overhead. This is just really great for just moving things along more quickly. And hopefully we'll see some of these bigger groups put out bounties for cross-disciplinary findings, which are right now, it's just hard to do cross-disciplinary stuff because it's either viewed as a threat or people just don't know how to judge it or gauge it. So we need new ways of creating bridges between fields. So besides the money, we also need the reputation. We need to have actual value to the reputation before anyone cares about it. It's kind of a chicken or an egg problem. Some of these are ways that we can start building up reputation without relying upon a centralized source of truth. I mean, this is a problem with like China's credit score or the United States credit score, where it's like it's really good for these corporations that have all the data, but for us, it's not really that good. We're losing. We don't have access to it. So I think if we see all of this data becoming available, then we won't necessarily have one like reputation score. It's instead going to be very personalized, so that it's more about like, what does my AI copilot think about you? And some of my values are embedded into that. And so reputation score becomes more personalized rather than just being some sort of objective measure. And then lastly, we need to be able to incentivize and coordinate active participation. So having ways of having dashboards where people are able to see what's going on and be able to flag things early on is really important. And then hopefully there's ways of rewarding people for doing that and participating in the system. So what could go wrong? In this scenario, it's the token farmer. Someone who's just going through the motions, but is just generating garbage. And we have to be careful because, right, if we're rewarding people for making studies, but the studies aren't good, we're going to get a lot of good, like not such good information in our scientific corpus. So we have to do something, and some solutions are like peer jury review before token distribution, so that if the peer review says it wasn't good, then you're not going to get tokens. Great, wonderful. We need to have some sort of staking system, so that way there's skin in the game, and if you're submitting a bunch of things and they're bad, you're losing money. We could be funding things that only get replicated later. And then we could also be seeing these adversarial research groups who have kind of a mandate to go find bad work and call it out. All right, on to the next and last problem, safety. Moving fast without breaking people. So I think we have to understand that moving slowly kills people. There's this concept of invisible graveyards where If the FDA approves a study and 20 people die, it's like, oh, you killed 20 people. But if the FDA doesn't approve something and it could have saved 20,000 people, do we know? No, there's an invisible graveyard. And we can think about it abstractly, but the regulator doesn't have that taint on the reputation. And so we have to find a balance. There's no perfect solution to this. We have to be able to navigate between moving too fastly and hurting people unnecessarily and moving too slowly and nothing ever gets done. And without central gatekeepers, there has to be some amount of accountability, and it has to be designed into the system, because if it's not, then it's going to get abused. So number one way of doing this is transparency. If everything is being put out in the open, people on the internet is going to call it out and call them when something does not look right. There's like this saying that the fastest way to find something out on the internet is to say the opposite version, and then everyone's going to come and be like, no, actually it's this, right? And so if you have all your protocols being posted and there's a way of people commenting on it, you should be able to get feedback, and bad ideas should be able to be identified faster than if we're just doing it to an IRB. And the IRB might only have 5 people on it, and maybe they don't know that that's a really bad idea. So indexing for the community is crucial. We should also start seeing consent being hashed. We were talking about storing hashes of documents. We should timestamp when did this participant sign up, what were they told during the informed consent process, and now we have proof that we gave them the risks, and when they went through the study, they knew what they were getting into, rather than we were misleading them. So real-time reporting, hopefully we will see adverse events when they get reported. Anyone who should know about this gets informed. Right now, when an adverse event happens, it's really just the clinic site and the primary investigator who's informed. And they do have an obligation to tell people, but do they always? Or do they just kind of cover it up when it's convenient? It depends. It really depends. But hopefully we should see a system develop where adverse events, that information is propagated quickly, so that way the study can shut down or what have you, pause for oversight. And then every part of the study should be subject to community review. We still have to have people ultimately associating their name and their reputation to a protocol. We can't just have AI do it. We have to really have humans involved. So decentralized ethics is not the same thing as no ethics. Let's see. Without an institutional review board, who decides what's ethical? Well, we have a community, we have a public protocol review, and we have automated safety mechanisms. So all of these combined is about the same quality as an IRB. It's just a different format. Informed consent, how do we track it? So embedded consent flows, so that way as they're doing the onboarding for participants, part of that is signing the informed consent document and having that be timestamped. And so that way it's all there. If there's an issue down the road, you can look and say, no, they signed this at this point. We told them this might happen. That way you're covering your own butt as a researcher. And then, what happens when something goes wrong? I think we have to expect that things will go wrong in decentralized science trials, right? There's no way to do good, exciting clinical research without sometimes bad things happening. It's just the nature of reality. But we can be more transparent about incidents. We can have protocols that halt once there is an adverse event. So that way everybody who's running the study is informed immediately, hey, stop, don't inject anybody else. Let's review what happened, see if we can figure out what happened, and then decide if we want to continue with the study or to stop it completely. We need to have emergency councils or emergency executives who are on the hook for this. So that way, if something does come up and it's kind of well, should we stop the study or not? It needs to be tied to a human or a group of humans for decision making. And your DAO should have a treasury reserve for covering medical expenses. So that way, if someone does end up in the hospital, your DAO is able to pay for it, right? That's a nice feature. So let's look at this more concretely. Let's say that there was a decentralized trial. They were doing a novel longevity intervention. The first person who did it, great, wonderful results, no problems. But the second participant, they're puking, they have a fever, they're in the hospital for 2 days. What happens, right? Who stops the trial? Who pays the bill? Who's liable? This needs to be built into the study protocol. And we need to not approve studies that don't have clear mechanisms for this, like, built into the protocol. And so, yeah, like, a DAO can never be held accountable. Therefore, a DAO must never make a medical decision, right? Like, ultimately, we need to tie this to physicians or experts who are willing to put skin in the game to move forward. And yeah, you could potentially have the DAO get bankrupted. And if your DAO doesn't have a legal entity, any person who's participating in the DAO could be sued by that participant. So this is why it's really important to have a legal entity for your DAO, or have a bunch of crypto in reserve to pay people when something bad does happen, if you don't have a legal entity. So just kind of recapping this, we want to immediately halt the study as soon as there's an adverse event. We want to have protection for the participants. We want to be able to figure out, was this just an incident with like this batch of medicine, or is it the actual treatment, or was it the way that the person administered the treatment? We have to figure out that solution. And then researchers who have a bad safety record, that should be something that you can see, or maybe you can prove that you don't have adverse events, right? Something like that. And so yeah, governance backstops. We need to have veto power. It's probably good to have insurance if your DAO can afford it for the participants. And it's good to have staged enrollment so that you do like the first 9 people and then you open enrollment after that. It's good to have the first few participants be people that you trust too, that they're not going to sue your DAO if they do have an adverse event. And it's also the same for dosing too. Like, you want to start with a small dose and then maybe increase it. And that might not always fit with like a double-blind placebo model, but it's probably still better to do that, where you're not accidentally randomly assigning somebody a huge dose at the beginning. You want to start with a smaller dose, and then after that's shown to not cause results, then maybe try the larger dose. And then lastly, for the safety stack, there's a lot of like public health issues that DeSci can probably solve. Tropical diseases just don't get a lot of funding because those governments don't have a lot of money. Like, the pharma companies aren't located in the tropics, and so malaria and other issues just are neglected. We're seeing antimicrobial resistance develop, which is like a problem that affects everybody, but what are we going to do about it, right? And then also being able to respond to COVID or pandemics quickly is something that DeSci could excel in. And so, like, for instance, some biohackers had developed a treatment for COVID, like a vaccine for a plasmid within like the first 2 months, but it never went anywhere, right? Because they weren't able to scale it. So if we can have a bunch of groups developing treatments, responses to new threats, then we just have to be able to scale it up. And DeSci might be able to do that so that we can pay these groups after it's been proven that their treatment does work. And we were able to like track data coming in from the entire world instead of just it being a clinical study that happened in Austria or whatever, right? Overall, this should help create more safety for global health challenges. And then I think lastly, I think the most realistic failure problem is like, what happens when DeSci breaks? Maybe your DAO gets hacked. Maybe people stop voting. Maybe bad actors come in. Maybe you can't reproduce the study. Like, what do you do, right? I think it's really important to build systems that degrade gracefully, so that even if your DAO stops working, it doesn't mean that all of your work just becomes worthless. And so like some ways of thinking about that is like exit clauses. So maybe if your DAO implodes, you give all of the rights to the data and to the IP to some nonprofit that you think is good, or some agency or some company, right? Fallback mechanisms. So like, let's say that your DAO dies, but you're still getting funding or like revenue shares from IP agreements. Well, then maybe it just becomes more simple. It doesn't go to the DAO anymore. It goes to the token holders themselves. They can claim a fraction of it. It's just creating these fail safes. And same with data preservation. IPFS is like being used as this like database for anything, but it's not as permanent as we would like it to be. That's kind of what the point of Filecoin is, but still, we probably want to think about data being backed up in multiple places, and having pointers to it be someplace very easy to find. So that way, if the fund, like it's no longer hosted in IPFS, where's the data set? And like, is this 5 or 10 years later, right? But if you have that listed with a bunch of backups on your composable research object, then that risk is mitigated. So just recapping, there's these huge problems facing decentralized science, but hopefully we have covered some of the tools by which we can address these problems. Trust, coordination, incentives, and safety. There are no perfect solutions for any of these, but there's ways of mitigating them. And hopefully through this talk, you've seen ways that we can mitigate them at scale without relying upon the traditional systems. So none of this is guaranteed. DeSci itself is itself an experiment. So what do we need to see success? We need to have more liquidity from DAOs that are funding IP tokens and funding prediction markets. We want to see strong privacy-preserving identity and reputation systems. And I guess what I mean by this is that if the EU or the US comes up with their own identity solution, and it's really good for the governments, but it's not good for us, then that's bad, because then we might be stuck with this, really dystopian identity system, and it doesn't give us the conveniences of being able to go from system to system conveniently. It just becomes a way for Palantir and the NSA and whoever to track us and potentially control our money and all of that. So we must insist on decentralized identity becoming a thing. We need user-friendly interfaces that can hide the complexity that I've described, right? Most people don't need to see the graph analysis. They don't need to see where all the data is coming from. They just need to be able to see the insights and be able to make sense of them. So we need clear communication of uncertainty levels. Right now we have, is it FDA approved? Is it phase 1? Is it phase 2? Is it phase 3? We need a way of looking at this where it's no, there's been 5 people or 50 people or 500 people. 80% of them had a good result. 8% had a neutral result, and 2% had a bad result. We need ways of making that really clear and digestible for end consumers, so that way they're able to make informed decisions. We need to see protocols and standards. They're not sexy, but they are required to make things scale. If every DAO is doing its own way of standards, then it's causing more friction. And so we need to have ways of working on the same page in the same language, and hopefully we'll see those develop in the next few years. And then hopefully we're going to see a bridge period where decentralized science is proving that it's very effective in places that aren't regulated. So longevity, nootropics, augmentation, peptides, these places, they desperately need anything, because right now it's just a bunch of podcasters, right? So if we can improve those markets, then maybe we'll start to see other traditional biotech move into some of the same structures. So how do we know if DeSci is happening? There's Ron Paul. He's excited that it's finally happening. So some clues that we can see that something is it's moving on track is that we start seeing alliances between DAOs, maybe Vita DAO and Biohacker DAO and whatever, Dog Ears DAO, and they're working together on a project and they're sharing an IP token so that way all of them get the upside if it's successful. We need to see decentralized IRBs form so that way there's a way of doing ethical oversight for studies conducted by DeSci DAOs. Hopefully we will start to see more partnerships between DeSci DAOs and traditional pharma companies. Pfizer invested into Vita DAO, which is like a huge signal that there's some legitimacy here. I think that having DeSci DAOs that either buy small biotech companies or they get acquired by larger biotech companies is a sign that the industry is succeeding and is able to fill its niche, which is mostly the high-risk early stage stuff. Hopefully we will see on-chain peer review actually get used. Right now it's starting, but we need the network effect. We need to see more and more people publishing on these things and for people to respect those published findings as much as they would any other study, I should say. And hopefully we will see AI agents not just doing research, but are being incentivized to do research. That should drive a lot of science forward. But even if you have all of these amazing discoveries and ideas, you still have to legitimize it and then distribute it as well, which is where hopefully DeSci will fill in the gaps. If you're thinking about making a DeSci startup, pay particular attention to these caveats. Science is still a way of generating truth. It is not the truth. There's a big difference there. Truth with a little t versus truth with a big T, I should say. This talk is just describing the pieces. It's not necessarily how they're going to be configured. Just because a technology exists, it does not mean a network effect will form around it. You can have the most amazing, beautiful, conceptual technology, and you've made the proof of concept, and everyone says it's amazing. But if nobody uses it, it doesn't matter. And so you have to always think about, how is this going to plug into the existing framework? How are we going to get users? How are we going to get adoption? And so this is part of the problem with startups. It's just it might be the wrong time. Maybe in 5 or 10 years this would be feasible. But until the pieces are there, it's hard to get started. So just be aware of where the field is at when you're trying to develop a startup. DeSci and crypto in general is best for medium-sized trust problems. I mean, what do I mean? If I'm just trying to prove something to my friends, it's overkill to get a token involved. But if it's more about corporations working together, then DeSci should fill that gap. And then the bigger scale, the nation states or whatever or global institutions should still handle things. But for everything in between, global and personal, DeSci and crypto makes a lot of sense. And DeSci can still be gamed, just like science can be gamed. But it should be easier and incentivized to call out the bad actors. If it's not, then that's a problem. So if we can solve these 4 problems, trust, coordination, incentives, and safety, then we should be able to develop new treatments in weeks instead of years, for thousands of dollars instead of millions of dollars. And we should be able to give access to this globally. And moreover, we have a new way of making truth as humans. It's really important in case our society actually does collapse. If the dollar implodes and all of that, then we really are going to need replacement institutions immediately. And if we can get the start of that now to fill in the gaps, then what comes afterwards should be better, hopefully. So if you've enjoyed this talk, I recommend you check out Unnatural Selection, a Netflix docuseries that I'm featured in, and then maybe also Citizen Bio, a documentary. I was given the chance to test out a gene therapy for HIV back in 2018 when I was in crypto, and I realized even if it worked, nobody would believe me, and it would be impossible to distribute it safely. And that got me thinking about crypto and how we can use that for science way back then. And so I've seen this field mature, and it honestly means a lot to me that you're here trying to learn and you're going down the same rabbit path as I am. So you've reached the end of the talk. Congratulations. If you are part of this course, then I recommend that you go and do the case study prompt and the reflection questions now, while all this is still in your mind. And more importantly, find your peers and start letting them know that a revolution is happening, and they can either get on board or they can get out of the way. But it's time for some changes in science, and I'm glad that you're part of them. Thank you.